As couples have divorced more, or divorce is more common for couples and people become more mobile as the job markets and the economy change, the concepts of what happens with those families and their children has also evolved. Couples frequently try to minimize the impact of their divorce or separation on their children. As economic necessity and the perception of the benefit of two fully hands-on parents have resulted in many such families having two full-time working parents and two half-time parents, it sounds fair for the parents, but what does the research tell us about how well the children in these families are faring? We have two distinguished speakers to give us the definitive answers to those questions today. Our first speaker is Paul Amato. Paul is the Arnold and Betty Hoffman Professor of Family Sociology and Demography at Pennsylvania State University. He's published over 100 journal articles and 5 books. He received the Reuben Hill Award from the National Council on Family Relations in 1993, 99, 2001, and 2008 for the best research article on the family. The Stanley Cohen Distinguished Research Award from the American Association of Family and Conciliation Courts in 2002. The Distinguished Career Award from the Family Section of the American Sociological Association in 2006. And the Ernest Burgess Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Council on Family Relations in 2008. Amato will be talking to us about deconstructing the good divorce.
The good divorce is an idea that has been sort of popularized during the last decade or two by a number of writers, and it's permeated the media, some academic thinking, some practice, and the good divorce has a number of components. The assumptions of a good divorce are that you can have one of these things if basically the parents manage to end their marriage in a fairly civilized way. Following the divorce, both parents continue to be involved in their children's lives, that parents will avoid conflict following divorce, and especially ensure that their children don't feel that they are caught in the middle between two warring parents who are each trying to get the child to take their side and be an ally against the other parent. And finally, that parents are able to engage in cooperative co-parenting following divorce, such that each parent voluntarily shares information about the child with the other parent, that parents try to have similar rules in both households, that both parents may even jointly attend special child events like birthdays or graduations, sports events. It's also assumed that good divorces can be facilitated through court-related processes, including methods of non-adversarial dispute resolution, such as mediation and so on, by requiring education classes for divorcing parents so they learn how to have good divorces and to be effective parents for their children in the post-divorce years. And finally, the most important and basic assumption of this notion is that when parents have good divorces, children will adjust well. Okay? And indeed, some authors argue that children will even benefit from the divorce if parents can indeed have a truly good divorce. They'll benefit by becoming more independent, more worldly, more thoughtful, more... I think there are some problems with the notion of the good divorce, and there are 4 that I want to talk about today for you. First of all, I believe that a lot of happy talk about divorce and how it can be good for kids detracts us from the very serious problems that are sometimes linked with divorce. I don't believe the notion of the good divorce is consistent with the research literature on children and divorce. It's not clear at all to me if court interventions can create more good divorces. And finally, I believe that promoting the idea of the good divorce may have negative unintended consequences for parents as well as for children. And I'll talk about each of these points now in turn. First of all, divorce is serious business. Here's a few statistics for you. Divorced women are 2.5 times more likely to be assaulted than are married women. Separated women are in particular risk. They're 6.5 times more likely to be assaulted than are married women, usually by their husbands or ex-husbands, And in many cases, these are couples that did not have a history of marital violence prior to the separation or the divorce. Divorced individuals, especially men, are twice as likely as married men to kill themselves. And adolescents with divorced parents are twice as likely as adolescents with married parents to kill themselves. All right? So here we see the dark side of divorce. I certainly don't want to pathologize divorce and assume that these outcomes are common, but I just want to raise this as a red flag that when we start talking about good divorces and all this happy talk about divorce, we need to remember that divorce can be lethal. Divorce kills people. It's not always written on the death certificate as the cause of death, but be assured divorce is part of the causal process that kills some people. So whenever you're dealing with a phenomenon that is potentially lethal, we need to be cautious about ignoring those risks, or perhaps putting those risks to the back of our minds. Here, if you look at the newspapers, you will find hundreds and hundreds of articles like this. I did a quick scan on a newspaper database, and it came up with hundreds of articles. You've seen articles like this before, I'm sure. Ex-Marine found guilty of murdering wife. This comes from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. His attorney said, and I left the name out, was so diminished by tranquilizers, antidepressants, and sickness that he lost his inhibition and fired the shotgun blast that instantly killed his wife. Motive is mystery and stabbing. The attacker, his ex-wife, is apparent suicide. From the San Francisco Chronicle. San Anselmo police are trying to figure out why the ex-wife of a psychiatrist stabbed her former husband in a frenzied attack and then apparently leapt to her death from the Golden Gate Bridge. Doctor guilty in decapitation from Chicago. A physician accused of decapitating his wife, cutting her body into pieces, and grinding the remains in a food processor because she asked for a divorce has been found guilty of murder. Okay, this is pretty crazy stuff, but divorce makes people, some people, pretty crazy, and they do crazy things. All right? So let's keep this in the back of our mind as we move through this happy talk about divorce. But now, let's get to some data. How do children fare in good divorces? And what I want to show you now is some evidence from what's called the Marital Instability Study. This is a study that I have been involved with for 20 years now with my colleagues at Penn State University, Alan Booth and David Johnson. What we did was we followed 2,000 families for 20 years, and we also followed 691 young adults from these families as they reached the age of 19. We had up to 3 interviews with each of these children, or young adults, I should say. So we know a lot about their lives and what happened to them. So this particular analysis I'm going to show you today is based upon 654 young adults who were all aged 19 or older at the time they were interviewed. Most were in their 20s, but mid-20s. For the children in this sample, I created a measure of a good divorce. And here were the criteria. First of all, the children had to report that they never observed any conflict between their parents at any time over payments of child support, custody arrangements, frequency of access, and how the child was raised. These were 4 separate questions, and people had to answer, no, I never saw any conflict between my parents across any of those 4 different domains, okay? And secondly, the child had to see the non-resident parent at least once per month following the divorce. So here we have situations in which children were able to maintain at least relatively frequent contact with both parents, and there was no conflict between the parents. Sounds like a pretty good kind of divorce. Now here are the group sizes. We have 31 young adults who experienced a good divorce by these criteria. We have 79 who experienced what I would call a typical divorce, that is one that did not meet these criteria. And then finally, we're going to compare them with 544 children who did not experience a divorce during this 20-year period. Now, I'm going to show you a series of outcomes for these children, which indicate to you how well these three different groups of young people, young adults, are doing based upon which group they came from. Now, the first outcome is a measure of psychological well-being. And psychological well-being in our study is a composite of 4 different indicators. The first is the child's self-esteem. The second is a checklist of psychiatric problems that children may be experiencing. We also looked at children's general satisfaction with a whole range of different domains of their life. And finally, children gave us an overall rating of how happy they are with their lives. And we put all these 4 together to create an overall summary measure of how well these children were functioning psychologically in early adulthood, and mostly in the 20s. Now, here we have children. I should say how this is set up. The 0 is the mean for the entire sample. That's just the average score. Okay? You can see that children who did not experience divorce scored above average. Children who had good divorces are kind of right on the line. They're pretty much average in terms of their psychological well-being. And kids who had the more typical divorces, the divorces that weren't good by these criteria, were actually way down here, which is actually a big jump. For those of you who know what I'm talking about, these are standard deviation units, so you can interpret these as effect sizes, and that's quite a large difference. The asterisk indicates that this group was significantly different from the group of children whose parents were continuously married. Now, if you look at this particular slide, it appears to provide support for the idea of a good divorce, right? It looks like children who had good divorces were functioning reasonably well, at least average, whereas kids who had other kinds of divorces, what I call typical divorces, were way down in terms of how they were functioning psychologically. So we see with this particular outcome some support for the idea of the good divorce that in fact may benefit children. But let's go on. Offspring's years of education by parental divorce. Notice that whether children had a good divorce or a typical divorce, they both had significantly less education than did children who grew up with 2 married parents. And in both cases, these 2 divorce groups are significantly lower than the married group. The difference is somewhere between about half and 1 year on average. So in this case, we don't really see evidence of a protective effect of having a good divorce when we look at children's educational attainment. Children's relationships with mothers. This is a measure that reflects basically overall how close children are with their mothers, how good the relationship is. And you'll see that if there's no divorce, the kids have above average relationships with their mothers. Good divorce, a little bit below average, but it's really the kids who have these typical divorces who score quite a bit lower in terms of how close they are to their mothers. Again, one could interpret this as support for the idea that good divorces protect children, at least with respect to how close they are to their parents, or their mothers, I should say, following divorce. Now, how about fathers? How close are they to their fathers? Well, here the situation's a little bit more complicated. We see that children in these typical divorces have the worst relationship with their fathers, but even children who have good divorces have significantly poorer relationships with their fathers than do children who grew up with 2 continuously married parents. Okay? So, in both cases, a divorce appears to lower children's closeness to fathers. Now we have a measure I call mean number of disrupted relationships. This is really trying to get at the stability of young adults' intimate relationships. And this is really a count of the number of times that young adults cohabited and that cohabitation broke up without ending in marriage, or they married and that marriage ended in a divorce. And the numbers here range from 0 up to 8. I mean, some children had 8 different disrupted, close, intimate residential relationships by the time we interviewed them. Note that children with both good divorces and typical divorces had much more relationship instability in their early adult years than did children who had experienced no divorce. Okay, so again, with respect to this outcome, relationship stability, you don't really see any protective effect of a good divorce. And finally, the percentage of offspring who had a non-marital birth. Notice that it's elevated primarily among young people who had good divorces and not among children who had the typical divorce. So if you put all this together, you get a really mixed picture. I mean, you find in some cases, yeah, the kids who had good divorces are doing pretty well, relatively well. In some cases, it doesn't seem to matter whether they had a good divorce or the more typical divorce. And in other cases, we see that it's the kids from the good divorces who have the more adverse outcomes. So there's really no consistent pattern here that shows us that across a range of different forms of well-being, children from good divorces are benefited or protected. Now, I've also been doing some other analyses with a much bigger data set, the National Survey of Families and Households. I don't have the data to show you today, but it involves 1,200 children with divorced parents, and I'm finding exactly the same pattern. That is, no consistent evidence that a good divorce actually protects children from negative outcomes. Okay. Also, I want to mention a study by Marquardt and Glenn that was conducted in 2006. They surveyed 1,500 young adults from divorced and non-divorced families, and they created a measure of good divorces and, not so good divorces in a very similar way that I did, by looking at how much conflict children were exposed to, how frequently they were able to see both parents following divorce, and so on. And they did find some evidence that, at least in some respects, a good divorce is better than a bad divorce. But they also found that many young adults who experienced good divorces agreed with the following statements. I often missed my father. 56% of children who had good divorces reported that they often missed their father. I have experienced many losses in my life. 53% of children who had good divorces agreed with this statement. It was stressful in my family. 52%. I felt like an adult, even as a kid. 51%. I was alone a lot as a child. 30%. At times, I felt like an outsider inside my own family. 19%. I did not feel emotionally safe in my family. 18%. These are all the responses of children who had good divorces. And we can see that even in this group of children who had, relatively conflict-free, relatively harmonious divorces, there's still a lot of pain showing through in terms of how they remembered their childhood. Okay, let's go to another topic. Can court-related interventions create more good divorces? Even if good divorces were good for children, uniformly, can practices like mediation or parent education courses, parenting plans, collaborative law, you can extend the list as long as you like. Is it possible for these kinds of interventions to actually create more good divorces that in fact will be good for children? Well, I've been looking at this literature pretty carefully in the last few months, and my conclusion is, after reading lots of studies, maybe. But there is really little to no scientific evidence that these interventions actually benefit children. We do know, take mediation for an example, that there are some positive outcomes. Couples who are able to mediate their disputes, are less likely to litigate. It saves them money, saves the court money. We know that couples who go through mediation seem to have less conflicted post-divorce relationships, but there's no evidence that mediation actually benefits children, as far as I can find in the literature. Why is this? Well, it just might be that some of the key factors that really determine how well children adjust to divorce are simply beyond the reach of any kind of intervention that we can yet imagine. And I want to show you an example that comes from genetic research. Divorce researchers in the last few years have just been getting into looking at the role that specific genes might play in affecting how children react to divorce. Here's the result of one recent study. Came out last year. Most genes in the human body are pretty much the same from person to person, but there's a small number of genes, about 1% in the human body, that take different forms from person to person. These are called alleles. The different versions are called alleles, or sometimes what's the other term? It'll come to me later. Anyway, what we have here are children who have the DRD2 allele. It's a dopamine receptor gene that determines how much free-floating dopamine is in the nervous system. And we know that dopamine, high levels of dopamine, are associated with feelings of calmness, well-being, satisfaction, and so on. A deficit of dopamine seems to create the opposite sort of feelings. Now, it's been shown in previous research that when children are born with this particular version, the DRD2 of this gene, it's called a polymorphism. That was the term I was thinking of. It increases the risk that these young people will engage in antisocial behavior. That is, people who have this gene are more likely to become delinquents as adolescents, more likely to become criminals as adults. But genetics is not destiny, because this gene, like almost all others, interacts with the environment. And environmental factors can literally shut this gene off or turn this gene on. Now, in this particular study, we have children living with two biological parents, and they either have the version of the gene that predicts antisocial behavior, or they don't have that version of the gene. And you can see that when children are living in stable two-parent families, the gene is not activated. There's something about living with two parents, whether it's the stability of the household or the supervision afforded by two parents, that keeps this gene from expressing itself. But if we look at single-parent families, you can see that this gene is expressed, and children who have this gene have a much higher level of delinquency than do children who don't have this particular allele. Okay? So, there's not much we can do about the genes that children are born with. It's just very likely that some children are born with genetic dispositions that make them vulnerable to divorce and all the events that follow in the aftermath of divorce. And some children are born resilient. That is, they don't have these risk factors that will interact with divorce to increase their problems. So a lot of children's adjustment to divorce, whether they are vulnerable to divorce or resilient to divorce, may just involve things that are way beyond our reach in terms of the kind of interventions that we can do. We're going to be finding out a lot more about this in the next few years. Alan Booth and I have recently obtained a data set that has lots of genetic information in it, as well as information about divorce. We're going to be mining these data to see if we can locate other genes that might have similar effects in terms of being protective or resilient with respect to life stresses such as divorce. Finally, I would argue that the whole notion of the good divorce has some unintended consequences. I forgot to bring something very important with me. First of all, it's quite possible, and I don't really have any evidence for this, that a good divorce may make it more difficult for former spouses to remarry. And I had this wonderful source for this that is sitting up in my hotel room right now. It's from a source that I consider to be very credible, Dear Abby, who I read religiously, by the way. It's fascinating stuff. So I'm just going to have to paraphrase it. I'm sorry. A man writes into Dear Abby, and he says, there's this woman I've been dating for the last year. Her name, let's call her Rita. She's a wonderful woman. I love her. We get along really well. But there's this problem. Her ex-husband is always hanging around. He shows up every week at their house, once a week, and cooks dinner for the whole family. She and her ex-husband are always going to events together to see the children, to be with the children. They travel together to visit other family members with the children. And the point is she over this guy or what? Because, I really like her, but I just don't want the ex-husband hanging around all the time. And Dear Abby's advice was, well, obviously they had a very amicable divorce, and they have a very good post-divorce relationship. And the father is highly involved with the kids, and the mother and father get along well despite the divorce. This can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending upon your point of view. Basically, if you marry this woman, you're going to get a package deal. You're going to get her and her kids, and you're going to get her ex-husband too. So the question is, can you handle that or not? All right? So you think about that a little bit. So you're a guy, let's say, in that situation. You might be perfectly willing to marry a divorcee who you're in love with. You're very happy to accept her children from a previous marriage into your family. Do you really want to have the ex-husband become a member of your family too? Or think about it from the perspective of a woman who wants to marry a man who's highly involved with his ex-spouse and his children. And once a week he takes off and goes and spends, the day with his ex-wife and his kids. He leaves, goes on vacation with them, goes to special events with them, and maybe leaves you home. Do you really want this guy you're going to marry to kind of spend that much time with his ex-wife? Do you really want her in your family too? I think that's a real issue. And by the way, this woman in Dear Abby had been divorced for 15 years and still hadn't remarried. I wonder why. That's a long time. Most women remarry within 5 or 6 years, not 15 years. So it's just something to think about. I've never seen any data on this, but, it's just something that makes you wonder. Also, another issue is that believing that a good divorce does not harm children may lead some couples to divorce prematurely. After all, consider this scenario. You've got a husband and wife. They don't hate each other. They're not hostile towards each other, but they've been married for 10 or 15 years. They feel like the spark has gone out of their marriage. They feel that life is passing them by. They feel like they're not really growing as individuals anymore in this marriage. So they sit down together and say, I think we'd be happier if we divorced and went our own separate ways. But we can do this in a civilized way, and, we can still, have a relationship afterwards and be good parents to the kids, And they say, okay, that's great. Let's do that. Let's go tell the kids. I'm sure they'll be thrilled. There's a lot of couples like that, by the way. I'm not making that example up. In fact, about half of couples who divorce these days, our research has shown, have no history of conflict, no history of marital violence, do not hate their spouses, in fact, like their spouses, in many cases say they still love their spouses, frequently do things together as a family, and they divorce for what I would call sort of existential, personal growth, new age kind of ideas, And these are probably the couples most likely to have good divorces because they had actually pretty good marriages. But this is not good for the kids. The kids hate this. If they see their parents fighting and screaming and hitting each other and being belligerent, and this goes on and on and on, man, when the divorce ends, the kids are usually happy. This is what I might call, this might be a good divorce, right? When it removes children from a toxic, aversive, harmful environment. That's probably a good divorce in my way of seeing it. Okay, anyway, just to summarize. First, I think the notion of good divorces detracts from the serious problems that can arise in at least a small fraction of divorces. Children do not necessarily benefit from good divorces. Courts are limited in their ability to create more good divorces, and the belief in good divorces may involve risks for parents as well as for children. So what should we do? Should we just throw up our hands in despair? Well, I don't think so. I think we should keep focusing on what we're doing, keep focusing on non-adversarial dispute resolution. I think we should keep parenting courses in places, but what we really need is a lot more research to find out what is it about these programs that might work and what is it that doesn't work. Right now, we don't have a clue. We're really just kind of shooting in the dark. So we need a lot more research. And I know that means it's incumbent upon people like myself and other researchers, perhaps in this organization, to start doing the necessary research to kind of tease all this out. But I do think we really need to get rid of this idea of good divorces and that they're good for kids. I think this holds us back a little bit. I think it's misleading. I think it's potentially harmful. And, you know, let's just face it, divorce is a mess, all right? Divorce is just a mess. Our job is damage control, all right? We can't create good divorces. We're just trying to protect children from the worst possible fallout of divorce. And then we can do that. But I don't think we can create good divorces. I'm not even sure we should be trying to. And that is all I have to say. Thank you for listening. And thank you.
Well, while we're switching computers here for a second, I had a quick question, since we're going to try to take questions at the end so that both presenters can have the opportunity to present their full piece. Let me ask Dr. Amato, you seem to have a pretty good data set for the children whose parents never divorced. And the thing that occurred to me was, did you have the opportunity to compare the children whose parents went through good divorce to children whose parents continued in bad marriages as opposed to what you defined as good marriages?
Not in this particular analysis, but I can tell you from earlier work that the effects of divorce on children are unpredictable, right? But the effects of parental discord, especially if it's chronic, it's extreme, it's aversive, and it's unresolved, is almost always harmful for children. So the kids in two-parent families who wind up spending 18 years of their lives in these dysfunctional married couple households don't do very well at all either. In fact, in many ways, they're the most disturbed children of the whole lot, of all the groups. I'm sorry, you can't hear me? Maybe I should use this microphone. Sorry, better? Okay. Yes, we've done a lot of work on this. There are some children in our sample who spent their entire 18 years growing up with two continuously married parents who had really crappy relationships, right? Who fought constantly. I mean, every time we interviewed these parents, they were fighting about something. The fighting was intense. Violence was not uncommon. And the parents really didn't like each other very much. They were hostile and critical of each other. And this is a really toxic environment for children to grow up in. In fact, in a lot of ways, these kids were the most disturbed of all when they reached adulthood. Divorce is somewhat unpredictable. Some children seem to adjust to divorce very readily for reasons we don't entirely understand. I mean, look at Barack Obama, for God's sake, right? His parents were divorced twice. His mother was divorced twice. He's doing pretty well, right? He's doing pretty well. Becoming president is not bad. And other kids just seem to be extremely vulnerable to divorce. We don't really know why. The effects of divorce are very unpredictable, but the effects of chronic, unresolved, hostile conflict between parents almost always seems to be bad. So in many ways, that's the worst possible situation for kids to be in.
Jennifer Mcintosh is a clinical and developmental psychologist, therapist, and researcher. She is the founding director of Family Transitions, a Melbourne-based center devoted to the study and treatment of family trauma with a focus on child protection matters and high-conflict divorce. Jennifer is also an adjunct associate professor at La Trobe University School of Public Health and has over 40 research-based publications to date with 2 books in the making. Tell us about deconstructing shared parenting is Jennifer Mcintosh.
So, following that tour de force, my job is to consider the literature on shared parenting post-divorce. Does shared parenting safeguard children's developmental outcomes? Does it contribute to the collateral damage of divorce? So you're doubtless aware that the shared care era has ushered in an emotive and polarising level of debate in family law circles around the world, between parents, between lawyers, between judges, in the press, and between academics. The Family Court Review has documented several rounds of heated debate about overnight care between notables such as Kelly and Lamb, Warshak, Solomon, Beringen, and tempered later by Klein Pruitt. While there are important consistencies in the research literature, finding them is like an archaeological dig, sifting through layers to get to the quality literature and noting the damage that's been done by cherry pickers who were there before you. In Australia, cherry picking of the shared parenting literature is something of an extreme sport. It's played by rival lobby groups and legal representatives as they selectively pluck research evidence congruent with their own values, causes and cases, isolating findings, lumping together data irrespective of the methods or the research tools that were used, or the sampling, at times irrespective of basic definitions like what constitutes shared parenting and what on earth do we mean by the question, does shared parenting work? Smythe has likened the interpretation of shared care research to responding to a Rorschach ink blot, and I agree. It can provoke an unconscious desire to find what the lobbyist needs to see. Janet Johnston wisely tells us not to be surprised about all this. She writes, family court matters constitute an emotional and an ideological cauldron where the most private and personal conflicts are seething and where very public and political struggles take place. And so it should be no surprise that when social science knowledge is brought into this arena to shed light on what to do about a problem, there is steadfast pressure to subject and subvert it to advocacy ends. My own research attracts the wrath of mothers and fathers alike, depending on which pieces clash with their purpose. A lawyer recently told me with some pride, and I quote, "Congratulations, Professor, on all this shared care research you've been doing. I love it. I know exactly how to cite it when I represent Mum and which bits to leave out when I'm representing Dad." If advocates support fathers' rights, they ignore the work of Amato and Gilbreth, sorry Paul, and particularly ignore Solomon and George, and they extract the bits of Kelly and Lamb and Bowserman that suit their mission. If they champion mothers' rights, they forget to mention Warshak, Kelly or Lamb. And so sometimes I wonder if there was a children's lobby group, who would they cite? So amongst all of that heat, I want to make a sensible beginning and first have a look at rates of shared parenting, a snapshot of the literature. Then I want to move off old ground onto some new data and some questions for the future. Now, rates of shared parenting, remember we're talking equal or near equal parenting, have roughly doubled in many countries around the world in the last decade, and they look a bit like this. So why is shared care on the rise? Smythe and Maloney tell us that the growth is supported by several mutually reinforcing socio-legal factors. the changing nature of men and women's workforce participation, psychosocial needs for work and family balance. Amato, Myers and Emery tell us it's about the changing social definition of the appropriate role of fathers, both in post-divorce parenting but also in childcare during marriage. Economic motivators are also emerging. In states like Wisconsin, anyone here from Wisconsin? Turning away for a minute from the general population to the group near and dear to us at AFCC. What is happening with high conflict populations and shared parenting? Well, here's a stat from our family court in Australia. Like many research studies, shared care is more frequently attempted in high conflict populations than in cooperative self-selecting populations. So in Australia, 30% of recent family court cases resulted in equal or near equal shared parenting. So these are people who required the assistance of court to make the decision. About 20% was awarded to father as primary parent and 50% to mother. In the US, the trend is similar and has been for some time. In their classic study, Maccabee and Mnookin concluded, our most disturbing finding is the frequency with which joint physical custody decrees are being used by high conflict families to resolve disputes. Several have questioned whether shared care is used in the high conflict population to appease warring parties, a compromise solution to a difficult problem, a modern version of halving the child under King Solomon's dilemma. Another reason for shifts in these rates, particularly in the high conflict group, legislation, actual and imminent. Several countries and states within the USA are actively exploring the merits of shared care presumptions in law. Down under, we are a little ahead of you. In 2006, Australia enforced what I call a near presumption for shared parenting. The genesis of that move came from a concern about absent fathers. As Smythe writes, in a somewhat curious juxtaposition of ideas, equal time parenting was first given formal policy prominence in the context of a concern about fatherlessness by the then Prime Minister. And he goes on to quote our former Prime Minister. He's the guy on the right, in case you've forgotten who the guy on the left is. John Howard, our former Prime Minister, said, and I quote, far too many young boys are growing up without proper male role models. They are not infrequently in the overwhelming care and custody of their mothers. Isn't that incredible language? I will be asking the committee to investigate whether there should be a presumption that children will spend equal time with each parent, and if so, in what circumstances a presumption could be rebutted. Now, the need to intervene with the widespread problem of father absence is absolutely clear, but the logic of doing that by encouraging equal shared time is not so clear, and that logic is under review by our new government. Joining the dots of the reliable literature, Smythe tells us that any policy response to paternal disengagement needs to be as multi-layered and as multi-pronged as the phenomenon itself. However, back to my story about what happened down under. Our former Parliament considered whether there should be a legal presumption in favour of children spending equal time with each parent, and it decided not quite, but almost. So now, in cases where parents are able to share responsibility, the court must consider, quote, the merits of making orders that the child spend equal time, or if not equal, then substantial and significant time with each parent. And outside of court, all lawyers, mediators and mental health professionals must advise parents that they could consider a shared parenting plan with 4 provisos. That these arrangements are in the children's best interests, that they are reasonably practicable, that child abuse is not an issue, and that family violence is not an issue. Now, I don't have a problem with the heart of the legislation. I think its heart is in the right place. I do have a problem with the way those provisos are interpreted, and I have a problem with the assumptions that underlie this sort of legislation. Let's look at some of these assumptions, and then we'll test them out against the literature. So this kind of legislation assumes that shared parenting in the majority of divorcing families, particularly those who require legislative guidance, is possible and sustainable, will prevent father absence, will promote real-life relationships, will enhance parental cooperation, will assist conflict management, and is best for children. So what does the research say? Okay, well, I want to start at the easy end. When does shared parenting last? Well, primary parenting remains by far the most stable form of living arrangement post-divorce. But when parents do share the care, researchers have noticed that the following are important to entering and staying on that pathway. I hope you can all read this long list of 18 factors. So things like low premarital conflict, adequate housing, workplace flexibility, motivation to make it work, tribal support, good mental health, good planning, communication, etc. And I'm sort of wondering how many of your clients look like that. So to enter and sustain shared parenting, you need to meet most of these 18 criteria. Shared parenting is increasingly thought of as a contemporary solution to preserving parent-child relationships post-divorce. It allows parents to experience the gratifications and rewards of real-time parenting. It eliminates stresses of sole parenting and supports fathers who seek a different level of involvement with their children that may in fact be more gratifying than that which they experienced during the marriage. In a modern age, work-life balance and career prospects are enhanced, particularly for women in shared arrangement. Researchers find consistently higher rates of satisfaction with shared living arrangements by fathers. Mothers, as I'll show you, in flexible, self-selected shared arrangements are not far behind. So the data on what happy parents in shared care think is pretty glowing. Smythe and Rogers indeed concluded the main beneficiaries of shared care appeared not to be the children but the parents. So does it work? Meaning, is it good for children? Well, time is short. You are an informed audience, and I want to begin with just accepting that children benefit if they can maintain good quality relationships with both parents after divorce. Does shared care help children's outcomes? Well, some, like Bauserman, tell us yes. Bauserman concludes from a meta-analytic study that children in joint custody, quote, were better adjusted than children in sole custody settings, but no different from those in intact families. I mentioned this study because it, like many, is a trap for young players. For those trying to make head or tail of the shared care literature, Smythe and Walcott tell us to be careful. There are some major methodological stumbling blocks with these sorts of reviews. For example, in this one, 2/3 of the studies are non-reviewed student theses, most of which don't control for important factors like socioeconomic status, and rolled up together in this conclusion is joint custody and joint physical custody. Other research tells us that regular sharing of children's overnight care between parents fosters closer and more enduring parent-child relationships, allowing a child to maintain positive and reality-based relationships with both parents that run less risk of depleted emotional availability that is associated with sole parenting. Some support the view that young children's attachments to their parents, particularly to their fathers, are fostered by frequency of contact within shared schedules. My own data indicate that children who sustain more father contact over time began with more father contact and began with more emotionally available relationships. So our findings suggest that quality of the father-child relationship creates and preserves contact instead of the other way around. The mother-child relationship proved to be different, but I will talk more about that in a minute. Developmental arguments against shared parenting surround the disruptive nature of the lifestyle for children and the disorganising potential of the lifestyle for infant attachment. As Klein Pruitt tells us, shared care adds increased challenge and risks at a time when social and emotional development are reliant on predictable, stable, responsive care. The meta-analytic commentaries on children's outcomes do agree, thank goodness, on this. Parenting, relationship qualities, and psychosocial resources are more important than the sheer structure of the arrangement. Smythe, as usual, says it in plain English. The idea that there is a clear linear relationship that exists between parenting time and children's outcomes, such that ever-increasing time necessarily leads to better outcomes for children, appears to lack an empirical basis. A separate line of inquiry, conducted by Johnston in the 80s and more recently in my own research, focuses on parenting arrangements in the high-conflict population. Now, these studies had small samples dealing with hundreds rather than thousands of families, and so they are subject to those limitations. But uniquely, these studies were longitudinal, involved repeated and extensive clinical assessment of parents and children, and our findings are in close agreement. Here are some. Litigating and high-conflict parents are different from cooperative, self-selecting parents. They enter shared care on a different track. They stay on that track by different means, and they have different outcomes. Parents in this population frequently experience elevated stress and anxiety through concern about their children's well-being in the care of the other parent. Continuing abuse of power by coercive and controlling ex-spouses can be amplified in shared arrangement. Children in conflicted shared parenting are exposed to higher levels of conflict between their parents, of the type that embroils them in or uses them in the expression of conflict between parents. Children are frequently distressed by this form of living arrangement, and there is elevated risk of poor mental health outcomes for these children. But I note in our legislation that there are no developmental guidelines or qualifiers, and the literature that exists around this topic is horrifically distorted by lobby groups as they search for a gendered rather than a developmental truth. For example, Kelly and Lamb's call for frequency of contact for preschoolers is an oft-cited reference in Australia, used to justify things like ceasing breastfeeding or young children travelling extraordinary distances every week by plane and car to achieve the gold standard of frequent short periods of time with each parent. The drive to articulate developmental truths requires a different type of research to that typically done in this arena. It requires carefully refined observations over time to help us better see the developmental detail that might lie in the larger picture. I want to talk now about some current research that's being done to try to draw some of these distinctions. Now, this is what mums think. This is their satisfaction with their care arrangement. So we have primary parenting on the far left, and we just have a simple scale here that says, look, how satisfied are you with your current arrangement? So primary parenting mums and flexible shared care mums are reasonably happy with the arrangement 4 years after it's been in place. Rigid shared care mums are very unhappy, and mums where contact has been lost with a father are pretty happy. What about dads? Well, dads are happy with shared care, whether it's rigid or flexible. They're a little less happy with primary parenting, and these dads are very unhappy when contact has been lost with the mother. Now, what do you reckon the kids are going to say? Have you got a bet? Children were, 4 years later, significantly more satisfied when they were in a primary care arrangement, then followed by losing contact with a parent. Now, I hasten to add that these were quite toxic relationships. Flexible shared care, and finally rigid shared care. Look how unhappy they are in that group. So, listen to Rick. He has equal shared care of 8 and 12-year-old kids. The thing is, and I get this now, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't at first, but it's about them. When I left, the thing that hurt most, killed me in fact, was not seeing them. I needed more of them. But back then they needed more of their mum, and yes, frankly, that's hard for a father not to take that personally, but hey, who's the adult here? I'm a good parent. They have 2 good parents. Anyway, patience has paid off. They live with me half the week. Pauline and I speak most days. I wish we didn't have to, but when you share care like this, you do have to. We've thought out with teachers which homework the kids bring to which house and about reading each night, stuff like that, so it's clear for everyone. Pauline says, this is his ex-partner, I wish we were a family, and of course I wish the children were with me every day, but I do see and I accept they need their dad. He's got a lot to offer. And the children, the eldest child chose these cards to represent what is it like to be him now, that they're not together. In contrast, there is a growing breed of shared care arrangements that stay in place because of the court order. Martin is one of these parents, and here's just a piece of his narrative. If I have to give her any of my time with the girls, I expect it paid back in full somewhere else and not on one of my work days. The mother complains, but there's nothing wrong with this arrangement. The girls are used to it. No, I don't take them to gymnastics on the weekend. Too right. I'm not giving up my time with them to pursue their mother's dreams. She complains that the girls never call her during my week. This is her problem. She needs to accept they never asked to call. Brenda said, I'm on edge. We live with it, and in my week we try to relax. The girls and I are quite scared, yes, too scared to go back to court. He charmed the judge, made me look like one of those mums who's trying to cut the father out. So I want to just quickly make some comment on two areas then to conclude. What did we find about the connection over 4 years between time spent with a parent and parent-child relationships? Well, amount, stability, duration, flexibility, all of the things we could look at about overnight time with father did not predict better parent-child relationships as reported by father or the child. Fathers who began with better relationships were those who went on to sustain flexible shared care arrangement. Greater amount of time with mother and stability of care predicted a more available mother-child relationship as reported by mother and child. These findings don't support theses that argue for an independent and linear relationship between greater time and better father-child relationship. The data remind me of what Mary Ainsworth found 50 years ago in her Uganda study. She wrote, one can only assume that there was some special quality in the father's interaction with his child, whether of tenderness or of intense delight, which evolved in turn a strength of attachment disproportionate to the frequency of his interaction with the child. Turning finally to children's mental health outcomes over 4 years, what did we find? Mothers and fathers independently rated the STQ, and here are the subscales. Like Trinder, we have not found any connection between the amount of time that children spend with parents and global mental health outcomes. Regardless of whether the arrangement was rigid or flexible, children in sustained shared care had elevated hyperactivity levels. Are there elements of shared parenting arrangements that over time impact children's growing self-regulatory functions? What aspects of these arrangements might undermine the emotional and cognitive equipment involved in sustaining focus? Is it the sheer pragmatic difficulty of carting schoolwork to and fro? Or does a child's lack of focus reflect a deeper and cumulative discontinuity in parents' focus? Is being held in mind half the time by each parent different from being held in mind most of the time by one? In summary, as I see it, the link between shared parenting and better outcomes for children post-divorce remains stronger at the ideological than at the empirical level. We don't yet have sufficient research to support a legislative presumption for any type of parenting arrangement post-divorce, and frankly, I hope we never do. The definitive papers are some way off, and those papers will draw on prospective longitudinal data with depth. The future research will put cognitive and emotional development from infancy through to adolescence under the microscope. Future research will distinguish a typology of shared parenting from parents who do it themselves with reasonable goodwill, building an integrated vision about their children's needs, through to parents whose psychological equipment for shared care is shaky, as you see, but amenable to support, through to parents who never had and never will develop the necessary equipment. Good research will articulate for us the child's experience of support, security and stress across various shared parenting dynamics. There is room for each of us in all of our roles to more carefully consider the developmental consequences of fitting the child to the clock instead of the clock to the child.
Gottman's identified a number. Well, the question is, do the factors that Gottman has identified in studying marital dysfunction account for some of the differences in the children? Is it the factors that led to the divorce, such as or intrinsic personality factors or relationship problems rather than the divorce itself? This is that leads to the child problems. This is a perennial problem that a lot of people have been looking at for, especially during the last decade, and the answer seems to be a bit of both. That is that some of the problems that you see in children following divorce were actually present before the divorce, and they're probably linked to things like conflict in the relationship, personality problems or psychological problems among the parents, poor conflict resolution skills, and so on. But then once a divorce occurs, it appears to make things even worse. So divorce appears to have an independent effect that goes above and beyond the effect of pre-divorce factors in lowering children's well-being.